Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be presenting my work on analyzing the threat to speech privacy from smartphone motion sensors. So as we all know, our smartphones these days house multiple sensors, and these motion sensors are used in many applications such as driving applications, gaming, image stabilization in photography, and various health applications. So because they are so widespread, there have been multiple exploits which have been researched that utilize the zero permission nature of these motion sensors to perform attacks. Zero permission means that any application or any web content can access the output of these motion sensors without asking for any explicit user permission. And using this vulnerability, it has been found that it's possible to infer the keystrokes from the virtual keyboard of the device, and using that we can find what password or PIN has been input during user entry. It's also possible to find and map user location and driving route using a combination of gyroscope, accelerometer, and magnetometer. So in the context of speech privacy, we can say that it's the leakage of certain speech characteristics to an unintended party, such as the leakage of the gender or the speaker, or maybe even the language. And of course, the speech contents themselves might be confidential, as in case of credit card information, social security number, the year of date of birth. So these are all confidential information that can be leased. Recent research has shown us that it's possible that by exploiting gyroscope, we can recover some of these speech characteristics. And talking about in a more benign setting, accelerometer can be used to pick up the keywords from the speech, but it's much more benign scenario. So in the light of the recent research in context of speech privacy threat from motion sensors, we see multiple media articles that perceive this threat as very, very serious, in the sense that these motion sensors can essentially be turned into microphones, which are constantly eavesdropping on you, like a microphone would. And the reactions to such news articles have been pretty reactionary, in the sense that people are thinking that they should not even use their smartphones. However, this is not true. The reason why it's not true is that these motion sensors are pretty much limited in their capability of picking up the speech characteristics because of their limited sampling rate. Microphone, on the other hand, they can pick up speech signals at a very high sampling rate, which is like, if you're talking like CD quality, the sampling rate is around 44.1 kilohertz. But these motion sensors, they are limited by the operating platform to around, especially in the case of Android, it's around 200 hertz. So, and that limitation is put in to minimize the power consumption. So it's not possible for these motion sensors to act in the same capacity as the microphones, and that's what we're trying to explore in this work. So we are trying to examine the threat posed by this exploit of motion sensors in the context of speech privacy. And in particular, we ask ourselves these questions that what are the possible scenarios where these motion sensors can essentially be used against a person to compromise their speech privacy. In addition, we also look towards what factors that contribute to the behavior of these motion sensors, and what leads to these motion sensors capturing this much amount of speech information. And finally, the question that is, well, most dangerous is, are these motion sensors able to capture a phone conversation that you are doing? So we built our threat model inspired from previous works, which has an external loudspeaker as an audio source for the speech, and gyroscope as the motion sensor. And we also, but in our work, we add we also consider accelerometer motion sensor. And then we also test multiple scenarios where we have weaker speakers, because loudspeakers, well, they can be pretty rich, and they can output sound at above 90 decibels. But we also test laptop speakers, phone speakers, and human speakers. And as you can see, I have categorized the threat model into audio source, the propagation medium, and the motion sensor. So building on that, we dissect the speech privacy threat, and we explore its reach in multiple scenarios. We perform this dissection on the basis of these factors, such as audio source, propagation medium, and we also consider the loudness level of the speech. So the idea behind that is that the louder the speech, the more information might be captured by the motion sensors. And we analyze, as I said, we analyze the live human speech impact against motion sensors. One point to note is that we are not trying to create a new attack technique, and we are not trying to improve the existing attacks. So we divide our speech source into two categories: machine rendered and live human speech. Machine rendered audio sources can be considered like the loudspeaker setup, the phone speakers. They are different from the live human speech in the sense that we can fine-tune their loudness and their richness. The propagation medium is when the smartphone, which contains the motion sensors, and the audio source are put on the same surface, and then we have a scenario where they are put on different surface, and of course, and then there is the air gap scenario where the speech signal has only one propagation medium, that is through air. The loudness level is normal conversational, which we can consider below 60 decibels, and the loud speech would be somewhere above that. So in order to assess the threat from these motion sensors, we look for the speech footprints in both frequency and time domain. To look for speech footprint in time domain, we look at the maximum range achieved by these motion sensors in presence of speech. So the idea behind this is that if these motion sensors are capable of picking up speech vibrations, then their sensor readings would be higher than what they pick up in absence of any speech or any external vibrations. And in frequency domain, we transform these signals from time domain to frequency domain using fast Fourier transformations, and we plot the power spectrum, and we look for speech footprints there. And we compare these the behaviors in presence of speech and in absence of speech to get an idea of the behavior of these motion sensors. So these are the experimental details. We use a subset of TI digit corpus which contains single word pronunciation. And as I said earlier, Android platform limits the sampling rate of the motion sensors on smartphones to 200 hertz. So as you can see, even though gyroscope and accelerometer have capability of outputting much higher sampling rate, they are limited by the operating system. We tested these scenarios, which are categorized as machine rendered speech and then subcategorized as placed on the same surface or placed on a different surface. For human speaker, we have human speaker speaking in a normal voice and human speaker speaking in a loud voice into their smartphone microphone. So for the results of machine rendered speech, the first scenario is the loudspeaker same surface scenario, where the loudspeaker and the smartphone motion sensors are placed on the same surface. And it's a recreation of an earlier work. And if you could take a look at the power spectrum for the gyroscope and the accelerometer, we can see that there is no noticeable impact on the gyroscope, but there is a noticeable impact on the accelerometer along the x-axis. So we can say that probably motion sensors will be affected in this case. Moving on to the time domain analysis, we have for each of the speakers speaking each of the word pronunciation in the TI digit data set, we plot the maximum range achieved by the motion sensors for that sample along y-axis. And if you see, for gyroscope, there are much higher peaks as compared to the motion sensor readings taken at other locations which are in absence of speech. The motion sensor readings which are taken in presence of speech, they are denoted in blue color, while the rest of the colored lines are for motion sensor behavior in absence of speech. So as I said, for gyroscope along y-axis, if you see, there are much more peaks and they are more higher than other colored speech lines. For accelerometer maximum range, the effect is much more prominent. If you see the z-axis figure, the accelerometer readings range in presence of speech which is denoted in blue color, is higher, while the rest of the colored lines are pretty much flat. In case when we have the smartphone speaker placed on a different surface than the loudspeaker, we see that the only way it is possible for the speech signal to reach the smartphone motion sensors is through the air gap between the two surfaces. So there is no possibility of any vibrations traveling across the surface apart from the ground, and we believe that there might be too much dissipation across the ground. And again, if you see the gyroscope and accelerometer frequency spectrums, we don't see any effect of pronouncing the one word for the motion sensors. The time domain analysis of gyroscope confirms our findings which we found on the frequency spectrum. We can see some peaks for the blue lines, but we also see peaks for the green lines, so that behavior is consistent across the locations which are in absence of speech and in presence of speech. And if you see the time domain analysis of accelerometer readings, they are pretty much flatline, and we don't see any peaks that indicate any presence of speech. Now, in the case of laptop speakers versus motion sensors put on the same surface, we tested two models of laptops, MacBook Air and ThinkPad, and we saw that the MacBook Air was able to generate a much louder speech signal as compared to ThinkPad. So we used MacBook Air as in our tests, and our initial observation with a multi-tone signal was that we found very minimal effect on accelerometer, and we found no noticeable effect on gyroscope. And if I zoom into figure, there is, like, within those circles, there is some impact on for the multi-tone signal, but it's very faint. And that's normal because laptop speakers are pretty much like low in loudness when compared to external loudspeakers. There were other scenarios that we created which were like laptop speakers and motion sensor placed on different surface. But again, since we saw that on the same surface it's much diminished response, on different surface it would be even more, it would be even more diminished. So we don't think it would be impacting the motion sensors to a considerable degree. And if you use phone speakers in our testing scenario, they are even less loud than the laptop speakers. Moving on to the human speakers, we recruited 10 participants, and we asked them to speak into the microphone of a smartphone placed on the table. But we asked them not to touch the smartphone so as to confirm that the only impact on the smartphone motion sensors should be from the speech from their mouth to the microphone of the smartphone and possibly to the motion sensors. And the frequency domain analysis shows us that we don't see any presence of speech in both gyroscope and accelerometer sensors along all the three axes. The time domain analysis of for the normal voice, which is, as I said, less than 60 decibels, we don't see any difference in behavior of gyroscope in presence and in absence of speech. Again, I want to remind you that in presence of speech, it's the blue line, and all the other colored lines are in absence of speech. Same behavior was observed for the accelerometer readings. Moving on to the loud voice scenario where the speech signal is more than 60 decibels, our results remain the same for both the frequency domain and time domain analysis of gyroscope and accelerometer. There is one lone peak out there along z-axis, but that's probably an aberration due to the inconsistent behavior of the user probably touching the smartphone. So summarizing our results, when we tested the loudspeaker same surface, we saw that there was some effect on gyroscope and accelerometer was definitely impacted. For loudspeaker different surface scenario, we didn't see any noticeable effect on both the motion sensors. For the laptop same surface scenario, there was minimal effect on accelerometer, so it may be possible for the accelerometer to get affected. But for the rest of the scenarios, we did not see any effect on the motion sensors from the speech source. So the insights from our work are that it seems that human speech may be incapable of triggering the motion sensor, especially when you are just talking into the microphone of the smartphone. Thus the name speechless. And the motion sensors may be able to pick up the speech characteristics in certain restricted settings, but that may be mostly due to the vibrations which are traveling from the loudspeaker across the surface to the smartphone. So it's not that the speech signal is traveling through air and impacting the motion sensors, rather it is the audio source is generating vibrations on the shared surface, and the motion sensors are picking up those vibrations. And we categorized it into 3 factors: the audio source, propagation medium, and loudness. And we believe that all 3 sources, all 3 factors have impacted this, are responsible for the motion sensor behavior that we observed. And one other observation was that the accelerometer seems to be more sensitive towards picking up these speech vibrations than gyroscope. In future work, we can look towards measuring these surface vibrations, and so that we can correlate those surface vibrations with the sensor response that we see. And we can use devices such as laser Doppler vibrometer, which measure the surface vibrations. Sensor fusion may achieve a better response than what we have seen, and of course increased sampling rate, which can be obtained in a relaxed threat model where the attacker has the capability of overriding the limit imposed by the operating system. And one such work has already been done, wherein using embedded motion sensors, having higher sampling rate and using sensor fusion, they were able to reconstruct speech, so it's definitely possible. And these are not the only scenarios that we can create. There are other scenarios that we have not explored. And we could also extend, so far we have only discussed smartphone motion sensors, but with all the smart devices and smart wearables, we can of course look into a speech privacy threat from that angle. Thank you for listening, and I'm open to any questions.
We have time for like 2 quick questions. Remember, when you ask a question, please state your name and affiliation along with it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michalevsky, formerly Stanford, now a startup. So I'm actually one of the authors of Gyrophone. I have actually a couple of questions. So one of them is, why didn't you run the actual machine learning algorithms on the recordings to see if it yields any results?
So as I said earlier, we were not looking to actually see to what extent it is possible to extract the speech information. So because when you say running those machine learning experiments, we'd be actually looking at to what accuracy are you able to perform speaker classification and stuff like that. But we were just looking at, we were looking at a more basic question, as in, are we picking up speech signals which are traveling through air, or are we picking up surface vibrations?
I see.
Because
yeah.
if
you're
you're
right. In our paper, actually, we didn't make any claim whether it's through surface vibration or anything else. I can share that in some of the recordings we made, I was just holding the phone next to the speaker, so there wasn't a mutual surface. Another comment about the paper is basically regarding the recording with the subwoofer. So actually, the data set that we published on our website, the recordings there were not done with a subwoofer. Those were pretty strong speakers, obviously pretty high dBs, but without a subwoofer. So I would speculate against the claim that the really low frequencies are responsible for picking up some speech. And I would hypothesize it's rather the aliases of the higher frequencies.
Yeah, it's, but that's true that, of course, because of the sampling rate limit, right? It's up, since this limit is like 200 hertz, you can only pick up frequency characteristics which are below 100 hertz. But if it's a very loud subwoofer, as you said, right?
No, so no, one of
Okay,
the...
unfortunately, we're out of time. So let's all thank Abhishek for a great presentation.